Completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Well, hello there and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde. The theme of this episode is Teach Your Children Well. You're going to understand exactly why that's the theme here in just a few moments. And we're going to start with a little bit of good news and what is actually a win for liberty, although the people on the losing end of this court decision, I'm sure, are portraying it as, no, it's a terrible blow against people's rights. But before I dive into this, I want you to understand there are a couple of different types of activists. And there is such a thing as good activism, but this is how you can distinguish between people who are being activists for a good cause versus those who are simply gaming the system and trying to trick it into doing what they want to do, which more often than not is to punish those with whom they disagree. A good activist will seek to put power to the individual or to stand up for the individual's rights and ability to act for himself or herself. The not so good kind of activist is playing to whoever the dominator is that's in power. So with that in mind, let's talk about this was a loss for Babe Vote and others who wanted to sign up as many students as possible to vote. The story coming out of IdahoReports.org earlier this week, rather, voting bills eliminating use of student ID at polls are constitutional. Now, on the one hand, it's being spun as, well, look at this. This is the problem with these ultra-conservatives, these hardliners, these, do I dare say it, extremists who are trying to limit how people can vote or where they can vote. But I'm going to ask you, why is it so important? Why are these student activists so absolutely desperate to get as many students signed up as possible? And the answer to that question comes down to, in part, what are they being taught in these institutions of learning? And I'm not just talking at college. I'm talking even in their high schools and in their junior high schools. They're being taught state supremacy. They are government supremacists, and that's the system that they are being told they must support. So, look, I'm not faulting the kids. They're young. They're inexperienced. They still have a lot to learn. Some of us remember, casting our first votes. I was proud to vote in the 1984 general election, but I'll admit at the time I pretty much followed what my parents did, and that was we voted Republican because why? Well, we're Republicans, and that's Reagan got my vote. So in retrospect, it may seem on the surface like, well, gee, why would the court rule that they can't use student ID at polls? Well, the ruling actually explains pretty well. So let's dive into that first. An Ada County judge on Monday determined that two bills passed by the Idaho legislature to eliminate the use of student ID cards for voter registration are constitutional. Now, the lawsuit filed in March by Babe Vote as well as the League of Women Voters of Idaho challenged House Bills 124 and 340, which eliminated the use of student IDs for voter registration, but provided for a new free form of identification. The organizations claimed it violated the constitutional right to equal protection under the law, as well as the right to suffrage. Those are pretty big claims. Well, this is denying us our ability to vote. But again, if you take voting seriously, then you want to make sure that votes actually count, that the system shouldn't be gamed or it shouldn't be susceptible to, do I dare say it, fraud or tampering. Not that that would ever happen, right? Most secure election in history. Now, the Idaho Secretary of State's office sought a declaratory judgment in the case, which means the case will not go to trial. Fourth District Judge Samuel Hoagland dismissed the plaintiff's complaint and declared in his written judgment that HB 124 and HB 340 do not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the Idaho Constitution. Now, going into a little bit more depth here, Hoagland explained his ruling, saying the challenged legislation places conditions on the right to suffrage rather than directly removing the ability of a particular classification to vote. So while a certain classification, age, appears to be more affected than other classifications, the condition is not immediately invalidated, nor does the condition make it impossible, let alone overly burdensome, for those in the classification to continue to exercise the right to suffrage. Bottom line is, students are not a protected class. Moreover, not every student is a young person. Not every young person of voting age is a student. The removal of student identification as a means for registering to vote and identifying oneself at the polls is not discriminatory, and it has a clear relationship to the stated purposes of HB 124 and 340. Pretty straightforward. Okay, for those who are saying, well, this is just Republicans trying to keep young people from voting. This is trying to make sure that young people aren't susceptible to gaming of the system. When removing the ability to use a student ID as a means of identification for voting purposes, the legislature did create a mechanism for people to obtain a free ID for voting from the Idaho Transportation Department. The removal of student identification cards as a permissible means of identification at the polls or for voter registration under HB 124 and HB 340 does not unduly burden voters. There are other valid and free means to identify oneself at the polls and for voter registration. So again, the students aren't a protected class. They still have means to do so. At the time of the bill's passing, legislators expressed concern about the security of student IDs because they don't always include a date of birth, proof of citizenship, or proof of address. Now, does that mean that it automatically led to fraud? No, but it leaves the door open to where if someone wanted to game the system, they could do it. And frankly, the more we're assured that that never happens, the more I'm convinced we need to be extra certain that it doesn't happen. So while Babe votes, among others, were disappointed, it was a win, at least for people who want a secure or at least an honest and transparent voting system. Secretary of State Phil McGrain, in a press release issued on Tuesday, said, "We're grateful for the successful resolution of this case. Voter registration is an important first step to being engaged in the democratic process. This legislation helped address inconsistencies in our law in an effort to build confidence in Idaho's elections." And there's the key. "I firmly believe that ensuring access to voting and maintaining security in elections are not conflicting goals. We have a great election system here in Idaho, and it was great to see that affirmed in this case." So again, notwithstanding that, there are those who will cry, "Oh, the Republicans, they're just trying to seize power and just keep it all for themselves." It's more about making sure that the system is not susceptible to people playing fast and loose with it. And that would include young students. Now, speaking of young students, you may think, well, why would you have a concern that, these students are being, taught to only vote in one direction or to be activists for voting in one direction? I want to give you some evidence of this in light of something that has developed around graduation time earlier in the summer. Do you remember this case that came out of, I believe it was Post Falls? Records request reveals LGBT teacher pressured administration into banning Travis Laura from graduation. Called students dumbasses. I mean, not very professional language, but thank you to the Idaho Tribune and to Casey Whelan for doing the Freedom of Information requests to get this information out there. Because if you remember, Travis was prevented from graduating after saying, in a rehearsal for graduation, guys are guys, girls are girls, there is no in between. And thanks to a lawsuit filed by Casey Whelan against the Kellogg schools, public records relating to the banning of Travis Laura from graduation have been made available. Now, it may be hard to read, but if you go to X, formerly Twitter, you can see this for yourself at the Idaho Tribune page. Newly released records from Casey Whelan show that the district's art teacher named Rachel Kruzmark threatened that if Laura was allowed to graduate, she would not attend the graduation. Okay, but the difference of opinion, but does it stop there? Well, now keep in mind, she is married to the female sheriff of that county. So now we have a little bit more depth. To this. Oh, so she was offended by the remark, and this is an email between her and Scott White. Scott telling her, "Don't give up the ghost yet. We need you to counteract the dumbass and balance things out." Well, more than balance things out. And Rachel Kruzmark said, "Two dumbasses. Seriously, almost done. P.S. I'm not going to graduation if Travis Laura is allowed to walk." So this is a teacher who is not just doing her job teaching, but now she is enforcing acceptable ideology because of something a student said, which I don't even know why this is controversial. Boys are boys and girls are girls, and there is no in between. That was self-evident not so long ago, but now that we live in bizarro world, apparently not so. So then there was a follow-up email that was addressing this. This is the teacher, Cruz Mark, a lesbian married to Shoshone County Sheriff Holly Lindsay, who wanted to punish this school kid because he spoke a self-evident truth that offended her LGBT ideology. And so here was the response from district officials. Less than 2 hours after her email threatening that she wouldn't attend graduation, an email was sent by Tori Shepard to Robert Casagrande asking for Travis Lohr to be removed from graduation. Now, it went even a little bit further than this, in that there were people in the community who said this is really unfair. Following a student-organized walkout protest, Lohr was written up for insubordination twice on June 2nd and June 5th after the graduation had already occurred. They just couldn't stop punishing him. Dakota Melu, a bus driver with the district who attended the protest, was fired, even though he was attending on his own time. Now he's suing the district for infringing on his civil rights. During this whole episode, the school district lied about why Travis was being banned from graduation, claiming they couldn't talk about the situation due to FERPA laws. Okay, they were trying to cover their butts and not doing a very good job of it. Look, it's clear that there is some pretty hardcore left-wing ideology that's found its way not just into the classroom, but into the school system itself. And there are those now who are educators who view themselves not as educators, but as enforcers of acceptable opinion, enforcers of the ideology that these young people are to be taught. Can we just come right out and say what it is? It's grooming. Not sexual grooming. It's grooming young activists and, of course, training them to go out there and vote for more government and bigger government and more control and more opportunity to punish those who don't agree with them. That would be pretty much everybody on the side of freedom. That sound like a good idea to you? To me, not so much. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Reporters are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.